Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first YouTube Ask the Stud question and answer show. And very, very pleased to have opportunity to reach a lot of fans that we don't get to talk to very much. And that is our YouTube, Southeastern Rewind. And this one is going to be the very first of a series of Ask the Stud question and answer programs on YouTube. We're going to do them every third Saturday in the month. This one is obviously being up on January the 21st, 19, boy, I'm way off, 2023. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to thank all the great people out there that participated in sending questions. This is some of the greatest questions I have ever seen and ever done on one of these programs. And I'm ready to roll with it. We have an announcer here, and he's going to tell us what the question is. And I'm going to do my best to give you a good answer.
All right, our first question is from Jody McCoy from Hickory, North Carolina. Considering both southeastern Knoxville and Gulf Coast territories shared borders with some of the very well-known NWA territories, many of which had now legendary owners such as the Carolinas had the Crockett's, Tennessee had Goulas, Georgia had Barnett, and Florida had Graham. My question to you is this: did you ever run into any issues or drama with any other NWA territories? And how were you able to maintain a healthy relationship with those you managed to work with?
Great question. I think his name was McCoy from, can't remember the state here, but we're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of people from a lot of different states. Great question. And I did have, and those four states were on the borders of southeastern territories. And I did have a little problem. The only one I ever had a problem with of any kind was Jim Crockett Jr., not Senior, but Jim Crockett Jr., North Carolina. And Jim Crockett, the original and the first Jim Crockett, was actually born in Bristol, Tennessee, and went on to have a huge territory, a monstrous territory there in mid-Atlantic, and great guy. My granddad and he were a couple of the original guys in the National Wrestling Alliance. When I started in Knoxville in 1974, in 1975, I started running some towns in West Virginia, Bluefield, West Virginia, and I didn't have a problem with running Bluefield, but then I booked a little town. I think it was Marion, Virginia, a little spot show town in 1975. Jim Crockett Sr. had kind of started to turn things over to his son, and I found out right away. Jim Crockett Jr. called me. I had not met Jr. I was familiar with Jim Crockett Sr. I had been to a couple of meetings with my father and with my grandfather Roy over to meet Jim Crockett Sr. in Charlotte. Anyway, I got this call from Jim Crockett Jr. and he said, "Are you aware, Ron?" And he was nice about it. He said, "Are you aware, Ron, that Virginia towns are basically towns that are recognized as being part of the North Carolina territory?" Now, we had sold advance tickets at this point. We had probably $2,000 in advance sales. Little small town. We're not talking about a big population or anything. It was going to be a big crowd. But anyway, I told him no, I wasn't aware, and I apologized. And I said, "How do you want me to handle this, Jim? I'll cancel the show, and I give the people the money back, or you can tell me how you would like for me to handle it." And so we talked about it for a few minutes, and I went ahead and I canceled the show. We gave the money back to the fans that had purchased their tickets. And Jim was nice enough then, within the next 2 months, I believe we ran one of the first shows at the Knoxville Coliseum. And I asked him, I said, Jim, our TVs overlap in a lot of places. And I said, I would love to have a couple of your guys that would wrestle on this first Coliseum show for me. And he said, Ron, I'd be glad to send you 2 guys. And he sent me Ric Flair and Ken Patel. Wow, what a great match they had. It was unbelievable, you know, great fans, Knoxville fans. Did not get much coverage from there, but there was all surrounding areas, such as the Tri-Cities. He didn't have his TV in many of the Tennessee cities. I had no TVs in his North Carolina territory. And they weren't really familiar with Ric Flair or Ken Patel, but they had a tremendous match. And it was really, it kind of started me out with a good relationship with Jim Crockett Jr., just like I had had with his father before him. I think he mentioned a few other territories there. Eddie Graham in Florida, Jim Barnett in Georgia, Nick Goulas, which is in the territory in the state of Tennessee with me, just west of me. Never had really any words with Nick, never had problems with Nick. I had known Nick since I was a boy because Nick was partners with my grandfather, Roy Welch. My grandfather established the territory. He took Nick Goulas in as a partner sometime in the 40s, I think it was probably. And I had met and been around Nick many, many times. So never had any problems with that territory. Never had a problem with Jim Barnett. I went and wrestled for Jim Barnett in 1973 in Australia. My father had a great relationship with Jim Barnett. Jim Barnett came and took over in Atlanta, bought out Gunkel, he bought out Lester Welch, ended the Atlanta Wrestling War. Never had anything but good. In fact, he came to my wedding, my first marriage, came to the wedding. Great guy, Jim Barnett, a real character in wrestling. Gosh, there'll never be another one like him. And I think the last territory you mentioned, the gentleman, Mr. McCoy, was Eddie Graham's territory in Florida. Gosh, Eddie Graham was like a father to me. He was, wow, and what a great, great human being Eddie Graham was. He was very, very, could be very, very mean and very, very scary. But he was a tremendous human being. And I worked for him from 1970 to 1974. Got my first opportunity to do a little bit of promoting under the tutelage of Eddie Graham. And he allowed me to run West Palm Beach, Florida. Great, great human being, as I said. Tragic ending to his life, tragic ending to his son's life. Great story, that Graham family and the Graham family history. But never had any problems with any of those, Mr. McCoy. And I want to thank you. Great question, very much for your question. And I hope that I answered it to your satisfaction.
Our second question is from Tony Gahan in Annapolis, Maryland. What wrestler would you have loved to book but you never did?
Wow. That opens a lot of doors, Tony. I mean, wow. I've been around some tremendous wrestlers that I wrestled in other territories and other parts of the world that, wow, I would have loved to have wrestled for me. The first one that comes to mind is I went to Japan, 1983, wrestled in Japan. It was December 1983. The Funks were working they were part owners basically of that territory with Baba, Giant Baba. And they wanted me to come and be part of their annual, once a year they had a tag team tour. It was basically every night was a tag team match. And first person that kind of comes to my mind was the guy that was my tag team partner for that Japanese tour in 1983, December of 1983, and that was Barry Windham. I knew Barry's dad, Blackjack Mulligan, and I never wrestled him, but had spent some time around him. I had never met Barry until this tour, and got some stories about Barry, other than the fact that, God, he was a tremendous worker. Wow, he was so good. I mean, I had never seen him wrestle. And our first night, we wrestled Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen in Osaka, Japan. Rode the bullet train, very first day on the tour. And when he went in the ring, within 3 minutes, I said to myself, this kid is unbelievable, man. I'd love to get him. We had that night, we had wrestling in Japan was really a trip in itself. When we went to the ring first, Barry and I both, and you couldn't understand your announcement. It's all Japanese. You really didn't know whether you were being announced or whether he was being announced or what was going on. But when the other team came out, Brody and Hansen came out of the dressing room. Brody had a rope with him, and he was swinging that rope, and Hansen had the rope, and Brody had its chain, about 15 feet long. And Brody was taking that chain and he was whirling it around his head, and he was at the back of the building. And when they came out of the dressing room door, seemed like half the people in the building ran back there to the building, back where they were. And they were trying to get close enough to touch him. And they wasn't going to have it. Brody had his chain, and Hansen had that rope, and they were just, Brody was taking that chain and they would drop it down on the floor, and they were Japanese. Most of them were younger guys, but he would drop it down onto the floor, and it would take the legs out from under them, and the back of their heads was hidden. And me and Barry stood and watched it, and it took them 5 minutes to get to the ring. They were real slow about it. And they left bodies all the way back to the dressing room door, people on their back laying down. And instead of coming on through the aisleway, they went to the middle of a section of ringside, and they went right through the ringside. They started throwing the chairs. The people were screaming. The building is pandemonium before they ever got to the ring. They had everybody in the building scared to death, running around, trying to find their seats, trying to find their chairs. And then we had the match, which is on YouTube. And it gives you a great idea of what it was like to work in Japan. These two guys were probably the stiffest, maybe that worked there ever, possibly, and we had a really tough match. Anyway, we got ready to go back after the event. And they put us in a cab, and they told us, the cab driver, where to take us to the hotel. He couldn't speak any Japanese. And he was panting in the back. I was sitting up front, and he was in the back seat. And we had just finished. We were on the last match. It was the first night. It was the television, and it was recorded. It was a TV event. And so he's back there, and he's huffing and puffing, and I said, Barry, what did you think of that? He said, Ron, my daddy never beat me like that. And I just cracked up. We only worked with those two guys one more time during that Japanese tour. We got to work with the two Funk brothers. We got to work with all different types of combinations. But Barry Windham, and I talked to him many times. I said, Barry, I'd love to have you come to work for me. And he said, Ron, I'll consider it, I'd consider it. But I never was able to get Barry there. And wow, I don't know how I could have gotten a much better guy than Barry Windham. As a young guy, he was a great talent all the way through his career. And he worked both heel and babyface. So he was really an extremely great talent. And Tony, that's my answer, and I hope that you find it to be a good one.
Our next question is from Gregory Rose, Elk Valley community of Pioneer, Tennessee. Ron, you and your brother Robert were both great wrestlers. You are by far my favorite of all time, and I hope to get to meet you someday. In your opinion, who was the best booker, you or your brother? Or were you both equal? And what is the worst incident or worst thing that you remember that has ever happened to you in wrestling?
Wow, what a great question there, Gregory. I love the part about me and my brother. Any conversation about me and my brother is always going to go in all kinds of different directions. But thank you very much for your question. Pioneer, I don't know where that is in Tennessee, and it sounds like probably a great city to live in. I mean, you're in a great state. I love it. So, yeah, and your question was, I think, who's the better booker, me or my brother? And wow, that opens a big door right there, Gregory. I mean, there's always been a contentious question between me and Rob about who's the best at anything. It didn't make any difference what it was, booking, wrestling, dogging steers, riding horses, cleaning stalls. It didn't make any difference. We always competed in things. But I gotta say, man, my brother was a great booker, and when I started my first company, Southeastern Wrestling, in 1974, in the fall of '74, I did booking a little bit myself. I had a little help from a guy that I brought in named Louis Tillett that helped me with some of that booking. And in my second year there, in 1975, Rob came into the territory to work, and he told me, he said, Ron, I'd like to try to book some. We had some great talent that was starting to come in the territory at that point. The Mongolian Stomper was just arriving. Ronnie Garvin was just arriving. So I said, well, geez, Rob, I'm willing to give you a shot, man. Go ahead and go for it. Well, Rob did a great job. He did it for 3 years. And then when we expanded and had Southeastern Gulf Coast, he ended up going down there and doing the booking in 1979, late 78 into 79. Did a great job. I was a pretty fair booker too, but I didn't actually start booking until about 1982. I decided that, I want to do things my way. I got some ideas of my own, and we started doing some really good stuff. By this point, we were no longer in the southeastern Knoxville territory. We just had that southeastern Pensacola, and all along the Gulf down there, we'd expanded back into Birmingham and all of Alabama. We had a good operation there, and that's about the time that me and Bob Armstrong did the angle where Bob was the special referee for me against Ric Flair. And Bob turned on me that night, and wow, that angle was probably the best angle we ever did. Maybe the best angle I ever did in wrestling. And we just got crazy after that. We were able to get his family involved and my family involved, and I was a heel, they were heels. It just went back and forth. Kind of went crazy. anyway, you know, I think probably I couldn't say who was a better booker, to be honest with you, Mr. Rose. Whether it was me or my brother, I think we both did a pretty good job as bookers. And that second part of that question was about the worst thing that ever happened to me in wrestling. And that brings back up Knoxville. There's no doubt in my mind that the worst thing that ever happened to me in wrestling was the wrestling war I had in Knoxville in 1979. And it was against a lot of guys that wrestled for me for years, that I really trusted, I really admired. It was a huge surprise to me that it ever happened. And I had a lot of guys leave me, Ronnie Garvin, Bob Root, Ron Wright, Bob Orton Jr., the great Malenko, about 5 out of a crew of maybe 14 that decided they wanted to own Knoxville. They wanted to run their own operation, and they wanted to compete with the one that I had there already, and that had been there for 5 years at that point. That to me really bothered me. And in my studcast, current studcast, that is really the subject matter of a lot of my current studcast, and it will be for about a period of a year here. I'm going a week at a time, giving the history of my wrestling career. I'm in right now with Southeastern Wrestling in 1979, just started into 1979, and we're going to be talking about that wrestling war and the worst thing that ever happened to me in wrestling, and that's it. The worst thing that ever happened to me in wrestling, without a doubt. Easy answer is the 1979 wrestling war between me and a lot of my friends that had been wrestlers for me.
Our next question is from Daryl Guffey in Chickamauga, Georgia. Ron, I've always have wondered how challenging it was for you to try to book 2 different territories at the same time. When you had Pensacola and Knoxville running at the same time, I can only imagine how exhausting that would be.
That's pretty much an understatement there. I've forgotten the gentleman's name, but wow, it was a tough deal. No doubt about it. People are lucky to be able to do one of those things. Booking, and I think there was something in there about being the booker maybe in 2 territories at the same time. Luckily, I really didn't book 2 territories at the same time. I booked in down there in Southeastern Gulf Coast. Me and Bob Armstrong that first year down there, and my brother was handling Knoxville. And I kind of, but beyond being a booker, when you own a wrestling company, and at this point you own 2 wrestling companies, they're 500 miles apart, their offices are. Wow, it's kind of a nightmare. I mean, the booking is just one small piece of running a wrestling company. And you got so many other things you have to do. So even though I was maybe only booking 1 territory at a time, I was actually running two territories. I had to be responsible for seeing that things were being done properly, not only down there in Pensacola on the Gulf Coast, but up in the mountains in Knoxville. And in order to do that, I had to run back and forth a whole lot. It was tough. I guess the quickest answer and the best answer and the honest answer is it was really tough running 2 wrestling companies at one time. And thinking back, I don't know how many or if anybody ever tried to do that before other than me. And I really sometimes wonder why I decided, when I decided to try to open a second territory, why I wanted a second territory. I mean, wow, it was really, really tough to run that second one. And maybe, in retrospect and thinking about it, that may be one of the reasons that I had a problem in Knoxville, is because I was having to spend a lot of time down on the Gulf Coast in Pensacola. and couldn't really handle the responsibilities of running two. So great question, sir. Really appreciate your question. Well, my answer is I wouldn't advise anybody to try to run two wrestling companies at once because it is a really tough cookie.
Our next question comes from Mark Cole in Newark, Delaware. In hindsight, do you wish you would have had more of a relationship with the magazines and later the sheets? While I understand your logic at the time, it would have benefited the legacy of your promotions that are only now being understood. Thank you for your podcast and the work of other historians. Keep up the good work.
Wow. Another great one. Another great question, Mark. Wow. There probably was a mistake on my part, and it wasn't that I had anything against wrestling magazines or the sheets. It was kind of a different day and time. We're talking about in the 70s, not in today's time frame for sure. And I guess some of that came from my father, who told me. I remember one time tried to make a real point to me that, you got a territory, and it might not be the best idea to have wrestling magazines hanging around your territory a lot, because he says they see what's going on, they see your crowds, they see how good you're doing, and all of a sudden, you're shining too bright a light. And he says maybe somebody then comes and decides they want to take your territory, they want to take your business. Wow, he was kind of right about that in a way. I mean, it happened to me anyway, no matter how I was handling the wrestling magazines. So I did, in my wrestling days, try to not to be too open to wrestling magazines and writers coming in and writing stories and giving me more publicity. But Mark, you have a great point. I mean, probably in hindsight, that was probably a mistake, because my territories were only known basically by the fans that lived there. And I always did good business. I always had great wrestlers. I always had a great reputation. I tried to run a good company. But not a lot of people knew what was going on in Southeastern wrestling. And then it turned into Continental Wrestling. It was the same thing. Eventually it turned into USA Wrestling. Had the three companies. I could have, it would have made my legacy better, undoubtedly, if I had let people know around the country and around the world just how good wrestling was in Southeastern and down south and in that part of the country. We were doing some angles that were tremendous. I mean, never been done before. I cannot imagine if the writers had come and watched the block busting angle with Joe the Duke and the Mongolian Stomper, and had carried that in the national magazines around the country. We would have been the talk of the town. Same thing with the angle with me and Bob Armstrong, in which Bob was the referee and turned on me in a world championship match with Ric Flair when I had him beat in the middle of the ring. It would have changed a lot of things for me, and it certainly would have made the legacy that I've left. I never really started to build anybody's knowledge of wrestling of Southeastern until probably 5-6 years ago, when I did my first interview with Jim Cornette on Jim Cornette's show, and Jim listened to the stories, and he after the show he was like, "Ron, God, you've got tremendous stories. Your history is just amazing." He said, you need to do something with all this. Why don't you tell everybody? Why don't you let people know what you did, and let people know about Southeastern and Continental and all your different companies?" And he was right about it. And so the last 4, 5, 6 years, the name of Southeastern has become a lot more popular and a lot more recognized than it was when we were actually running those companies in 1974, from 1974 to 1988, at 14 years or so. We really kind of missed the boat in a way. And Mark, it's a great insight there, and a great question, and thank you very much for asking it.
Our next question is from Craig Brinkley in Bristol, Florida. What is the procedure for calling a match?
Well, that's short and to the point. Craig, well, that's a good question. I mean, some of that is, I think, lost itself, and the wrestling today. The calling of a match is something that started back way back in my granddad's day in the 1920s, and there's an art to it, and there was a way that it was recognized that it should always be done. Certain parts of it were simple. I mean, pretty much it was standard in the industry that the heel called the match. Probably some reasons for that, and another good thing is it was a little more difficult, obviously, that being the case, to be a heel than it was to be a baby face. And if you were a heel and you end up being great at calling the match, you usually were a lot more competent than a baby face. And so, so you call the match as a heel. It was standard. There were certain circumstances in which you wouldn't call the match. So let's say that you were a young heel and you're working with Bob Armstrong, as an example, and Arn Anderson, let's say, is working in his second year in the ring with Bob Armstrong. Well, Arn didn't call that match, I can tell you that, because Bob was Bob. In fact, it was probably so so obvious to Arn that he would never suggest it or even ask Bob, who's going to call the match. So there were situations in which a babyface did call the match, but it was only because the heel was probably green, and he didn't know how to handle it. So great question though. The match was basically handled by the heel. Babyface took over sometimes. Even the heel would call for a comeback. The heel would call for every high spot. He would call everything that was going to happen in the ring. Occasionally, if you were a babyface, I remember as I got to be better in the business and I had spent a few years in the ring, I would call a spot sometimes. And, I never had anybody that didn't like it. I never had a heel that said, no, I don't want to do that. But it was part of the deal. Pretty standard, always been the case. Heel calls the match, wow, the great heels, the great heels were. That's why their matches were so good. That's why they were great heels, is because they knew how to call a great match. They don't know today's wrestling has I don't think it has a spot for a person that can call a match or does that. I think now it's all set up. You talk about it in the dressing room, I'm sure what's going to happen exactly. And there's no need anymore for heels to be leaders of the match and calling the match. The business has changed that much, and it's a shame because you had so many different heels so many different guys that were really, really good. They all had their own style. And what happened is every match was a little bit different than the one before. If you got a booker that's going to call everything the whole night, tell everybody exactly what's going to happen, the fans out there aren't going to see what they got to see in the 70s and 80s and the 50s and the 40s, those great times in which you had a bunch of different heels that always called a different match than the other guy did. And it gave those fans that great thrill of seeing so many great matches because of the fact that they were allowed to call them.
Our next question comes from Brett Baker in Hangburn, Arkansas. My question is, how many times did you and Cowboy Bill Watts wrestle together and against each other?
Well, Cowboy Bill, man. Well, Hangburn, Arkansas. I guess you got to see Bill Watts quite a bit over there in Arkansas. So, there's Bill Watts is such a character in the sport. So many wrestlers were intimidated by him and thought he was too strict but his relationship with me was totally different, I guess, than most other wrestlers, and it started in a very, very strange way. Having the wrestling war in Atlanta, 1972, 73. In about 73, Bill Watts was doing the booking for the territory. Bill Watts decided he was ready to leave Georgia, and he wanted to come to work in Florida. He wanted to become the booker in Florida as well as coming to wrestle in Florida. Bill Watts was most of the time a heel in his career. He was a heel in Georgia at this point. In fact, he and my brother was in that territory. He worked a tremendous little program that lasted about 5 weeks where Watts says he gonna beat Rob in 5 minutes. They wrestled in every town, and Rob just ran around the ring, but Watts never got his hands on him. And they had a little deal, and then finally, so Bill Watts is getting ready to leave, and the big baby face in the territory, or the guy that they wanted to, Watts was the champion, they wanted Watts to put the belt on Mr. Wrestling 2. Well, another great wrestler, another great worker right there. Watts, for whatever reason, did not want to put the belt on Mr. Wrestling 2. I was wrestling in Florida, in the state of Florida. This is about 1973. I was over pretty good. I was a baby face. I was the Southern champion that year. I was the Florida champion that year. So when Watts just flat sat down with the ownership there and said, I'm not going to put the belt on him. I'm not going to let him beat me. They said, who would you let beat you, Bill? And I'd never met Bill Watts. I don't know where this came from, but Bill Watts said Ron Fuller in Florida. And so I got a call from an Atlanta promoter, and he said, Ron, would you like to come and work in Atlanta? Bill Watts is going to be leaving. He's going down there to where you are in Florida, and would you come up here and he's going to put the belt on you? And I was like, well, gee, why would I say no to something like that, right? So I go up and me and Bill have a match, and Bill asked me in the dressing room. He says, "I'm going to bust my head. I'm going to bleed in this match, and I'm going to get some blood in the match." And he says, Ron, how can we do that in a way in which it's going to look really good, as something that nobody's seen, nobody can do, nobody's done? And so I told him, I said, give me 10 minutes to think about it. And I came and sat back down with him again. Now, he's the heel. He's going to lead the match. So I said, Bill, when we get ready for me to do it, I said, I'm going to shoot you in the ropes. I'm going to drop down. I'm going to leapfrog you. And when you charging me to come to hit me for the next one, I'm going to scoop slam you. But I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to stagger backwards with you. I'm going to drop you over the top rope, and we're both going to go out on the floor. I'm going to go down, hit my head on the apron. You're going to go out on the floor. And he was like, no. He goes, no, are you kidding? No, Ron. I said, I weigh 300 pounds. You can't nobody can do that with me. And I said, I think I can do this. I believe I can do it. And so, and that was a big contentious matter. He came back 2 or 3 times before we actually went to the ring. He was like, Ron, you sure you can do this? Well, we're going to find out, Bill. So anyway, we did the bump, and wow, it was spectacular. I mean, and when we came back after the match was over, he said, God, that was amazing. Wow, Jesus, that's unbelievable. Anyway, he goes to Florida. So that's the first time that I ever wrestled him. Okay? He was asked how many times I wrestled him. First time I wrestled him. So I go back to Florida. A couple months later, he shows up. He's going to be the booker there. He decides that he wants to be partners with me. He wants to start out not as a heel. He wants to come to Florida and begin as a babyface. And so he wrestles partners with me. We wrestle the best teams in Florida. We're on top. Win titles, the whole deal, with champions, the whole thing. That goes on for about 6 months. This is in 1974, and I'm thinking about my own territory at this point. And Bill comes to me one night and he goes, Ron, it's time for me to turn heel. And he goes, we're going to do it. I'm going to do it with you. And so we worked a finish that was extremely hot. I can't remember what city it was in, but I do remember that they were going to get him. He had a hard time getting to the dressing room. Great finish, as all of his finishes were. He was a very smart booker, very smart promoter, a very smart businessman. And so he had a great finish, turned him heel. I stayed in the territory until that day I left the territory. Me and Bill Watts were still having this feud that probably ran for 4 or 5 months. So the ultimate answer to the question is, I don't have any idea how many times I wrestled with him and against him. It was a great number, that's for sure. But I will say that Bill Watts was one of the best wrestlers I ever went in the ring with. And I have a great deal of respect for him, not just as a wrestler and a promoter and an owner of his own territory, Mid-South. He knew how to handle the wrestling business. And we still have a great relationship. Me and Bill Watts, I talked to him quite a bit. He's been on my Super Studcast with me. He's done so many things with me, and one of the great talents ever. And a great question. And I hope that answered it for you properly, sir. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Gene Gunderson, Cowboy, Minnesota. Have you had a conversation with Bob Roop about the Knoxville takeover and Plan B? Has the hatchet been buried?
I'm not surprised that this subject's come up. This goes back to the same thing we've talked. I think I've said something about this already, about this studcast. And we're in 1979. Bob Roop is the booker for me in southeastern Knoxville. He starts in about September of 1978 as the booker there. And he remains the booker all the way up to probably about May of 1979, and all of a sudden to me, I have no idea what is going on, but he has, just so that people kind of know the background of me and Bob Roop, my relationship with Bob Roop. And I met Bob Roop first in the state of Florida when I was very, very young, 6 months into the business. We were in a snake pit together for a long time. I had had a great deal of respect for Bob, and we were friends. He came and wrestled for me. He came and booked for me. He went from wrestler. I gave him the job as booker, and then he turned on me, and not just me, but he took some of my other friends. It was like when I made a booker out of him in September of 1978. It was like throwing one rotten apple into a barrel of apples. I had great talent, great wrestlers. Wow, just Bob Orton Jr. and Ronnie Garvin and the great Malenko. Just a talent, a territory full of talent. And I put him in charge of all of them. And so eventually he decided that he wanted to run my territory. He wanted to own the territory. I found out that 2 years earlier, when he left Florida in about 1977, he went to Roy Shire's territory in California. Roy Shires made him the booker of his territory, and he tried to steal Roy Shire's territory. And it didn't happen. Roy found out about it, and he sent him packing. My problem was I didn't find out about it until it was too late. And so Ronnie Garvin, Bob Orton Jr., the great Malenko, and Ron Wright all decided that they were going to start their own company called All-Star Wrestling, Knoxville, Tennessee, to compete with Southeastern Wrestling. Got their own television show. And we went to war. That's part of the subject of these current studcasts that I do. It's part of every one of them, the history of this war. And it's pretty interesting. It's, wasn't a lot of wrestling wars, and this one was a pretty darn interesting one. Anyway, as the answer to your question, no, I have never spoken to Bob Roop personally since 1979. I have Ronnie Garvin. Ronnie Garvin and I have made up. Bob Orton Jr. and I have made up. Ron Wright wrestled for me, again, in Continental Wrestling Company and in my USA Wrestling Company. The great Malenko I never spoke to again after 1979 because he was a Tampa guy. He lived down there in Florida, and I didn't spend much time in Florida. But then you mentioned the Plan B video, and this is, I don't know if people want to go, we're right here on YouTube now. If you want to go to YouTube and you want to look up Plan B video, you're going to see something that if they had aired this video in 1979, 1980, it would have killed wrestling throughout the world. It was such a bad piece of video. The same 5 guys that I just mentioned decided that they weren't going to win the war. And they said, we're just going to maybe kill the sport. And so they went on TV. They recorded themselves, each one of them saying that wrestling's all phony, always has been. They told how everything was done. And they just basically let the cat out of the bag. They pulled the curtain back on kayfabe. I mean, what they did, if they had aired it, would have, I think, not just destroyed Knoxville wrestling, but it would have gotten around everywhere. Thank goodness back in those days, there was no social media, there was no YouTube, there was no all the things that the media type situation that we have in this country now is so different. But the Plan B video would have, I saw it, I never saw it In 1979, they cut this in 1979, and I didn't see it till about 4 years ago. And I had a guy call me up, contacted me on Facebook, and said, "Ron, I have a video that you might want to see." And I was like, I finally got in touch with him. I said, "Well, what kind of video?" He says, I don't want to tell you. I want to send you the video. So they hid this video. Thank God they hid this video from 1975, 79, when the wrestling war in Knoxville, up until to about the 2016, 2017, something like that. Once the video surfaced, it was like red hot. It went everywhere. So those that haven't seen it, if you see it, there's no need for me to tell you about it, because I cannot tell you how horrible it would have been. But if you're a wrestling fan, you will know instantly that this would have been the end of professional wrestling before the 80s. And the 80s were magnificent years for the sport. Wow, every territory, everything in wrestling, everywhere was on fire. That era would have never been had it been this Plan B video released. Great question, sir. Never have I spoken to Bob Roop, and I really appreciate it. This is a super question.
Our next question comes from Brandon Folsom, Cumberland Gap, Tennessee. Who would be on your Mount Rushmore of best heels in the business?
Oh, wow. Well, I love these questions. My goodness, this is a great group here, man. That's a great question. Well, there could be 40 names that I could come up with pretty darn quick, man. But I got to give it a little bit of thought here, because you're just asking for 4 out of probably, no telling how many great heels there have been in the history of the sport. Hundreds of them. Well, I'm going to start with one of them that was in the NWA World Champion, Harley Race. Harley Race was, to me, and I wrestled 12 NWA World Champions in my career. Harley Race was maybe the best. Harley had a look about him, and he had a style in the ring that was so good, so effective as a heel. He called great matches, really great matches, different matches. You didn't go in and have the same match with him 2 times. They were always different match. And he was so dedicated to the wrestling business that I remember the first time that I ever wrestled him in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was 1977. We drew the largest crowd in the Knoxville Civic Coliseum in the history of the sport, in the history of that building for a sports event. Still the record. 50 years later, 40 years later, I don't know exactly how many years it is off the top of my head, but it's still a record in that building, record crowd. We had a tremendous match. I remember the 3rd or 4th time I worked with him in Knoxville, we had a Texas death match, and didn't have a world title match. All the others were world championships. We had a Texas death match. We did a finish that, and he didn't tell me exactly what he was going to do in the finish. He just said, "Ron, when we get down to getting ready to go home," he goes, "we're going to end up outside. We're going to end up on the announcer's table." And he says, "I'm going to body slam you on the announcer's table." And then he said, "and then you just move. And, you know, and he didn't say what I'm going to do, where are you going or whatever, you know. Not knowing what was happening, this was most unusual. That you usually knew what the heck was going to happen in the end of this match. But it's a Texas death match, so obviously you got to get hurt bad. Somebody's got to really be winning in a big way to win a Texas death match. You got to stay down, the 30-second rest period, the whole deal. We'd have had 10 of those false finishes and 10 count, the 30-second rest period, the 10 counts, and you got back to your feet. So finally we go for it. We're both out on the announcer's table. When he picked me up to slam me, I was horrified because, you know, the announcer's tables are not, you know, solid. They're not oak and made to be stood on by 400 pounds. And so when he picked me up and he slammed me on the table, he went back in the ring and then he went up on the top rope. The announcer's table was right down by one of the ring posts. He went up on the top rope and he stood right straight up on the top rope. Now he had hit me years earlier in Florida, my first time I ever wrestled with him, with that diving headbutt off the top rope, which was a fantastic finish, but that was done inside the ring. You know, he set you up in the ring, suplex, whatever, and then he'd go climb up the rope, and then he would put his arms down by his side, and he would come off head first. He wouldn't put his hands out to catch himself, and he would put his head somewhere between the side of your face and your shoulder, and you just hope that that's where they went. Because if he could knock you out, he could have busted your brains out with that move if he ever messed it up. Anyway, on this one, he had slammed me on the table. He went out, he climbed the turnbuckle, and he stood straight up just like he was going to do it in the middle of the ring. And he had already told me, he said, you move. I'm going to slam you and you move. And I couldn't believe he's surely not going to do this. And he came off that top rope. I rolled off into the floor, and he went head first through that table. His feet were sticking up in the air. His legs were the only things that you could see of his body. They counted him out. They counted to 30. They had the 30-second rest period. They counted him out to 10. I left the ring. I went to the dressing room, and he was still head down, head first in that table. I don't know how long it took him to get him out of the table. One of the best bumps I ever saw. Tremendous, tremendous bump. Tremendous, tremendous heel. Terry Funk. Terry Funk, I put on my Mount Rushmore. Terry Funk's another one of those guys like Harley that had so many. His style was so different. He could do anything in the ring, and you could see that as his career developed. He ended up being a maniac, taking somersaults off on concrete and doing all this good barbed wire matches and everything else. But you never had the same match twice with Terry. And I had some phenomenal matches with Terry. I must have wrestled Terry Funk 30 times in my career. Probably 5 of them for world championships and world championship matches. One of the greatest. Wow. And it is the second here that I've got so many names are whirling around in my head. Johnny Valentine. Johnny Valentine, to me, was one of the most awesome heels that ever put on wrestling tights. A pounder. He was a pounder. I mean, guys hated to wrestle Johnny Valentine. He was so stiff. He wanted to wrestle hour matches. He could not wrestle in a match. I remember one time Louis Tillett coming to me and him in a dressing room in Orlando, Florida, and he says, Johnny, I want you to do this or that kind of finish. And he says, we got a lot of matches tonight. He said, I'd like for you to go get about 30 minutes. And Johnny says, he goes, no. And he says, well, what do you mean, no? And he goes, no. He goes, why? Is that longer than you want? He goes, no. He goes, I can't do it in 30 minutes. I can't get it there in 30 minutes. So, so Luis says, well, how long do you need? And he goes, I'm not going a minute less than 45 to get it there. And what he meant by getting it there was he would, during the course of the match, he would front face lock you and take you down on the mat. He would throw you out on the floor. He would grab you up, jerk you on the apron. He would bend you back on the ropes. He would hammer. He would hammer you in the head, hammer you in the chest, hammer you in the stomach, just pulverize your body. Wrestling Johnny Valentine, it was horrible. Most guys just couldn't stand it. I remember Tim Woods, who had very real light-colored skin, and he would, 2 days after he wrestled Johnny Valentine, you would see fist prints in his skin, where every finger was. He would, in his stomach, every place that he hit him, it would bruise him. And it would be there for 3-4 weeks. It'd stay there, So Johnny Valentine, great heel. Wow, wonderful heel. Had such believable matches and wrestled 90% of the matches. He didn't do high spots. He had a unique style. Nobody wrestled it. Nobody else could do it. And so Johnny Valentine, and one of them I've already mentioned, Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody, to me, was one of the most magnificent heels. He had the size, he had the look. He was a monster in the ring. He was the monster in the ring. Had great matches with him. Didn't have the opportunity to wrestle him, but 3 or 4 times in my career. And I relished all those matches. I really, really enjoyed it. I was one of the few guys that enjoyed to wrestle, Johnny Valentine. I was a nut. Guys said, Ron, what do you like it, don't you? And I said, I do. I love working with this guy. He's tremendous, So Bruiser Brody, same thing. Bruiser just took the match. He not only called it, he just took the match. He gave you very little. But if you got enough heat as a heel, you didn't need to have a big, huge comeback as a baby face to get over, and then when I think about these 4 heels that I just talked about, you got Harley Race, you got Terry Funk, you got Johnny Valentine, and Bruiser Brody. The thing about all 4 of those, when I think about it, and maybe what really makes them great heels, even better heels, is every damn one of them was a great baby face when they wanted to be. And that was the mark to me of great talent in the ring. If you could work both directions, if you could be both baby face and heel and do a great job of it, that was to me, they belonged on the Mount Rushmore. For that reason, they were all great heels that were just as good when they wanted to be babyface.